what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to Seeds of Revolution. We have a great interview today with Dr. Yannick Giovanni Marshall. Dr. Marshall is a scholar, a writer, and a speaker specializing in anti-colonial Black thought, political exile, and dissent. He taught contemporary Black thought in the School of Critical Studies at Cal Arts before fleeing the United States amidst the escalating suppression of Black studies, protest, and academic freedom. His forthcoming book, The End of Supplication, The Invention of Prostrate Blackness as a Replacement for the Maroon, challenges the containment of Black radical traditions through liberal and civil rights discourse. Through essays in Al Jazeera English and public talks delivered globally, including in the US, Iran, France, Germany, Czech Republic, and Australia, Dr. Marshall offers urgent provocations on anti-Blackness, colonialism, and the global crackdown on dissent. Dr. Marshall earned his PhD from Columbia University's Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. He has an MA from Columbia University's African and African Diaspora Studies Department, and he has taught at Cal Arts, Hobart and Williams and Smith Colleges, Knox College, Colby College, and Bates College. With all of that said, welcome to Seeds of Revolution, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you very much.
So I was hoping you could start off, I gave a little summary of your CV, but I was hoping you could start off by telling your audience a little bit more about your background, your scholarship, and specifically why you have chosen to leave the United States.
Okay, so I was born and raised most of my life in this little colony that's called Canada, in Toronto. And I basically was interested in poetry and Black thought and a number of different guises for as long as I can remember, basically. And then I eventually ended up pursuing my PhD for a number of different reasons. And so because I was very much interested in the Caribbean, I was interested in Africa, but I didn't know that much about African-Americanness. I ended up pursuing an MA in African American Studies at Columbia, because it was also in Harlem, and I always wanted I revered what Harlem, the image of what Harlem was, so I ended up wanting to be both in school, but really just to be in Harlem. And then that continued to Columbia. I picked Columbia because at that time, there was a right-wing racist list about the most dangerous schools in America. And Columbia was number one.
And you chose the most dangerous one.
Exactly that. Exactly that. Because I know that basically what the enemies consider dangerous is some of the most helpful and intellectually curious and sustaining forms of community and thought that you can find. Like, I was coming up from a place where in high school, I was suspended for putting my hand up and criticizing this teacher when they were talking about Africa is backwards because it's of Africans and corruption, and never mentioned colonialism, etc., and all that. So that was my first. I was a very quiet kid writing my little poems in the back. I never got suspended before. Got suspended immediately. Then, in the University of Toronto, where I did my undergrad, some teachers mistakenly sent me an email trying to get me out because I was criticizing my Canadian politics class. It was a class that was basically Canadian propaganda, and I had some Indigenous activist friends that I wanted to. I actually brought them into the class themselves. And then one white girl said that I was being intimidating and we were being intimidating. And so they kind of sent me an email saying, mistakenly trying to find ways to get me out, etc. So that environment made things inhospitable, to say the least, in terms of my upbringing. And so the dangerous schools like Columbia were places of refuge for me, and I loved it. It's unfortunate that Columbia is now the vanguard of the repression against the Palestinian struggle, Black struggle, etc., being basically a police department. So that turned around quickly, but I left that before that all happened. So I have a love-hate relationship both with education and with Columbia and with Harlem.
Why did you end up leaving the United States?
Because I was a Black person and a writer at the same time, and so that was an extremely dangerous position to be in. I mean, when you're not a sycophant and you're interested, even if you're interested in general, like writing about daisies and happiness, that is a very dangerous situation to be in. But I wasn't only writing about daisies and happiness. I was also thinking about how white supremacy operates, how colonialism operates, etc. The police. A lot of my writings were about the police. And so not only was I teaching that in class, but I was also writing about it. Most of my writings actually ended up in Al Jazeera, so they were widely available. And so that generally I've always been getting like hate messages, etc. But to know that the educational system and the state were in cahoots to hunt and, if not hunt, repress um, anti-colonial voices in ways that they haven't been before, made not only was my general life, I mean, it's always a precarious life living in the colony, but not only was that intensified, but I was worried, and I still am worried, that that type of repression does affect what you write about and what you think about and how you think. It's not just the fact that the police might raid you or knock down the doors and catch you. It's also what you do in preparation of the event that the police might raid and knock down your door. And so I couldn't tell whether my ideas, teachings, writings were changing, but I didn't trust myself to be as forthright as a number of other people that are on the front lines right now today, still speaking the same way, even in the midst of fascism. And so because I had that way out, I wanted to safeguard my writing and my thinking, and that was one of the best ways to do it. So I'm still like, I mean, I went back I was living in LA, and when the uprising started, I mean, that just like the runaway slave that comes back to the plantation when it sees it's burning, like I kind of was inspired to kind of come back around and see what's up. But in general, there is nothing there for me, whether it's upward social mobility and just general capitalist gains in terms of like trying to get a better job. I mean, even the university system itself is just a slave catching operation now. So NYU shut down a meeting about international aid, which is the lightest thing that you can talk about. And so if I ever wanted to be back in Harlem, back in some place like NYU, I mean, if they're shutting down U.S. aid conversations because it's anti-governmental, then they probably wouldn't like me speaking about the problems of colonialism. So even if I was to consider myself a bare bones careerist, there wasn't even a place of that for that anymore. So there's just nothing there for me.
I guess I'll start off with a big question. What do you think accounts for the turn towards fascism repression in the United States? I mean, obviously Trump, but in my opinion, maybe you disagree, but Trump is the symptom, not the disease. And you said, I think you said something really interesting a minute ago. You said Colombia has become the vanguard of repression. And I remember, like you, when Colombia was the vanguard of liberation, especially in, the 1960s and the anti-war movements and the Students for a Democratic Society. What do you think accounts for, whether it's Colombia, whether it's NYU, whether it's the larger political structure of the United States, how easily it has been for it to crumble from the inside when faced with this, tin pot, clownish wannabe dictator?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew, but I do have a number of suspicions. Like, one of them is that these universities are basically just businesses in the first place, and so they're industries in the first place. That just had as their cover story the fact that they were interested in freedom of thought, etc. But that was a product that they were selling. They were really still businesses. And so, like before Trump, I was hearing about campus police raiding the dorms of my Black students or PLC students. Um, that there was a whole bunch of harassment and danger for a number of marginalized students in general on campus. A lot of outspoken professors had similar like backgrounds to me in terms of repression. And my high school experience, they have it as junior professors. So the university was never a good and safe place for people who were interested in anti-oppression. You can ask basically any active student at SJP. Uh, Black Panthers probably didn't have a good time when they were back in Oakland, etc. So it was just this is generally the case. Um, as to why it's spiked up, I can't say exactly why now, but I always knew that settler colonialism does not, as its propaganda might sometimes, if it's in liberal hands, pretend, uh, evolve into a peaceable, equitable society that has corrected its wrongs, etc. The end goal and the structure of settler colonialism always ends towards elimination, to the replacement of populations, to mass incarceration, to fascism, to Nazism, whatever you want to call it. That is basically the ingredients of what settler colonialism is. And so it's just a natural expansion. I can't say why now. I mean, there's probably a number of different forces as well. If you ask a number of Marxists and anarchists, they might say that there are the contradictions of capitalism at its late stage. And so it's throwing everything haywire. And so just to kind of maintain everything, you gotta bring your batons and your goose stepping out. That might be the case. It might be the case of just general rising of whether it's Pan-African consciousness or the anti-oppression, the global anti-oppression movement kind of being more visible. And so they would have to contain or separate themselves from that. There are a number of different things. What I do know is that I do not sign up with this idea that, yes, it is Trump that has set things up, because that is basically a cult of personality. And at the same time, I don't agree with the other position that Trump and the Democrats are basically the same thing. I believe that inside of colonialism, there are factions to it. Just like in South Africa, you had one that was relatively racist, but kind of liberal racism. And then you had a conservative racism in the both camp, etc. So there's always been factions. There's always been fights within white supremacy. And so I don't believe that the United States is anything different. It is a set of colonial community that has its disagreements, so they go back and forth. And so just as at this point, it is the settler right that has won rather than the settler liberals who have been kind of hushed up for this moment. So basically, a racist occupation is now under the occupation of a more racist occupation, a more overtly violent occupation. And so we just get caught in the middle. In some ways, the liberals just would put us into mass incarceration and do terrible things to us under the rugs. And so we had a number of spaces to kind of manipulate that in the ways that work. Whereas this one is a much more totalitarian, widespread, nothing goes type of violent racism. And so there are less opportunities to do some of the things. But at the same time, there are more opportunities to be able to counter it, because obviously what power of what liberals had was for people who were radical, or especially Black radical thought. We would say things, well, the settler colonialism will eventually turn into an elimination zone. And people will be like, hey, well, you're just over exaggerating. And now, with this administration, it's like we say the settler colonialism will turn into an elimination zone. And yeah, that checks out. Well, so there's much more. So the power of propaganda was weakened in an overt racist society, an overt racist administration. But we just do what we can wherever we are, basically.
I'd like to ask you about some of your writings, and we'll link in the show notes to your website for listeners who are interested in Dr. Marshall's work. He's got a great archive of a lot of his work, videos and writings on his website. One of your writings that struck my interest was a piece you wrote for Religious Dispatch in September 2020 called "The Only Common Denominator of American Conservatism is Anti-Blackness." For those of our listeners, especially our Canadian listeners who are not as familiar with American politics and history, what do you mean by that? What is that? How does anti-Blackness, how is it become and expressed as the common denominator of American conservatism?
Well, for me, it is clear that the conservative movement at no point in the history of the colony um, was not directly interested in violence against Black people. Um, if it was in the long epoch of Maroon War that might be considered the slavery epoch, the conservative position was to keep slaves and to be more violent to the slaves rather than not. In the Jim Crow era, the conservative position was to let's have Jim Crow and let's not change it, and more of it if we can. In the Reagan slash the modern period, the conservative position is for gerrymandering the stage, reducing Black people's ability to vote, more police violence, and more exoneration for the violent police, etc. So that has been constant. Whereas the cover story of what conservative means has always been different things. Like we're interested in fiscal policy, we're interested in type of a being socially conservative. Sometimes we're interested in libertarianism and all. There's a number of different things, and they all shift in whatever moment comes. Like right now, it's the shift between fiscal conservative, fiscal hawks, as some of them call it, deficit hawks, and people who want to go into more government debt and raise the deficit on the Trump sphere. So they're both those are very pretty much polar opposite position, but both of them agree in the necessity of repressing things like people who say Black people matter and Black lives matter, etc. So what is constant is anti-Blackness. Everything else is a cover story for it. And once you realize that the conservative is basically just that same lynch mob member that is now wearing a red hat rather than um, uh, a straw hat, that basically everything remains exactly the same. And so it would be better, instead of to think about left and right and conservative and liberal, to think about where exactly did that power that was interested in the violence against Black people, where after it was frowned upon, where did that metastasize to? And that, I would say, is general conservative beliefs. I mean, obviously, liberals are also conservatives, but they have a different tactile.
Does your scholarship mesh at all or conflict at all with Dr. Kendi's work on anti-racism and his work on the Black and the anti-Black experiences in the United States?
Which Dr. Kendi? Is it Abraham Kendi?
Yes, yes.
Oh yeah, I have nothing to do with him. And in fact, like, I mean, obviously he's like, I don't know how well he's known. He's basically, for a while, because he is the star of any apologist for white racism who also doesn't want to be understood to be conservative racist. So they would hold up somebody like him as a way to be able to say we're all racist. Everything is racism, and so this is what you need to do to fix it. And it's I don't know. I haven't read his book. I just didn't smell it, and I can tell the type of vibes that he's on. And so, yeah, I'm in some ways, I mean, it's not a fair comparison. I have nothing like, I can't call myself like the opposite of him because I'm such a minor figure. But at the same time, I almost can define myself better by showing myself as the inverse of what he is. And
And
that is an anti-colonialism.
I was going to say, is that because of your focus on anti-colonialism as opposed to his focus just on race?
Yeah, well, I am focused just as much as race as he does. Is that my interest in race isn't to show the possibilities of colonial reform. My interest is in race is to be able to define and to analyze exactly how colonialism expresses itself. And so I'm almost only interested in race. Even if you want to call it racial capitalism, or even if when you're thinking about like capitalism itself, my interest mainly is the colonized sector and what is happening to the ghettos and the slums and the people who are put as not only workers but workers times blackness, workers times the inferior races, and these people are who I am most interested in. So I would say that I'm very much interested in race. I am just I don't believe that whatever contributions I make is at the service of settler colonialism. And so I think we'd have a lot to disagree about.
Why do you think for a long time people in Canada and the United States were so susceptible to the narrative that Canada and the United States are not colonial projects? I think it's starting to change now, especially with young people, especially when they see things like the genocide in Gaza. But for a long time, the idea calling the United States, calling Canada a colonial nation, that was antithetical to history, to political success, to polite society. Why was it so successful for so long for the people in power, for the capitalist class, to be able to really convince people that these were not, in fact, what they are very obviously on the wrapper, which is settler colonial enterprises?
Yeah, I mean, it is on the wrapper. They would, I think, for a while, it was called the Upper Canada Colonies.
Yeah.
In Canada, it was definitely called colonial Virginia and all these type of things. It was definitely on the wrapper. But the reason that I think that it hasn't really even, and I speak mainly about white Marxists, white leftists, etc., why they were resistant. This is beyond their connections to wanting to maintain a reformed settlement, or a very, very reformed settlement, however they understand it, is in general is because of the dehumanizing and the dehumanizing practice that is the genocidal occupation. It is extremely important for nationalism, for whatever brand, left, right, etc., in settler colonialism, to make the native disappear. The native doesn't disappear. The indigenous is indigenous, but they would make the native disappear. And in making the native disappear, even on the level of language, to say nothing about the actual genocide itself, um, that is important so that they can now excuse that population from their consciousness, and then be able to speak as if the indigenous do not exist. So that therefore, if the indigenous do not exist and there was never a colony and nothing ever existed other than us and our problematic class imperfections that needs to be overcome. So even if you're a white leftist, the reason that you wouldn't call it a colony, and this happens subconsciously, it's not, or it's not even subconsciously, it is the narrative of nationalism is so strong that it has possessed the minds and imaginations of even of those who want nothing to do with the state. The invisibility is written into that consciousness directly, and so you begin to think in terms of like, if there is a colony that happens, it's happening in South Africa, it's happening in Kenya, it's happening and you might even, if you're lucky, have them say that it's happening in Australia. But you cannot say it is happening here, because here is a different place. In fact, sometimes they would say that they would almost try to redeem the original slaveholders that have evolved into presidents, or founding fathers, as they say, by saying, well, what George Washington did was he was trying to he was moving against the colonial England. And so they have now put themselves in the position of the colonized, because again, the people who they have been dragging, like George Washington was dragging his enslaved people around, are entirely invisible to them. They are dehumanized, and again, because it's this genocidal occupation, they have even eliminated them from their minds, and so they don't speak of, even when they're trying to have the revolution, they don't care about the revolutions that happen all around them, because they don't see it. The only people who matter, the only people who count, the only people who can be counted are white people, even when they say that they are interested in world revolution. it's still in the settler consciousness an inability to fully recognize the non-white person. And so that is why um, other people might very well call me an anarchist and a Marxist and a number of different things, and that's fine. Like I have definite connections um, one way and the other way. But I think one of the reasons why I emphasize anti-colonialism is because I do think that I exist, and it is important for me to think about my family and the people that I care about. And so I'm already outside of a position that does not um, that facilitates my elimination. It's already going to be an uncomfortable situation for me.
I'd like to turn to another one of your writings, which I really enjoyed. It's was published on Al Jazeera in May 2021. It's a short dictionary of liberal language of policing. And there's a quote that just popped out at me that really resonated with me and my experience. I have background in criminal justice, and I've known a lot of police officers in my life. And this quote I thought was just incredible. You write, quote, "For the police, liberal language is as indispensable as a service pistol. Far from being merely a weak shield against the onslaught of police violence, it is a cloaking device and its gun turret. It drapes the peculiar institution over with flags and reform talk and mounts a defense against the calls for its abolition." I thought that was a genius quote, and I'm hoping for our audience you can just elaborate on what you mean by the liberal language of policing and how that language is employed to stymie efforts at real revolution.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that piece. And to be honest, I took a lot of time to try to be as exact as I possibly could. So I don't know if I'll be able to be to elaborate in any significant way here. I can say though, what I've noticed is that what so again, as I said, a liberal and a conservative, left and right settler are basically just all still colonists, so they all kind of work for the same goal as far as I'm concerned, right? Um, so the liberal language in policing, or the idea of the why the liberal speaks in the way that they speak about policing, is so that it is not economical to just take a baton and continuously beat the indigenous, the native, the black, etc. Because they eventually rebel. They can see it very clear that this is something that I don't want to be a part of anymore. And so it is that's how you face an insurgency all the time. And the more you directly repress people, the more they don't like it. And so they try to do something about it in whatever way that's possible. And so to have a much more sophisticated and advanced way to police and to protect policing, all you do is say that the police is always imperfect. That's one of the things that they love, and incapable of reform, or is failing, or there's a number of different ways of speaking about the police that present a kernel of hope, so that when you are being bled, when the baton strikes you, when you are being shot or pulled out of your car, it's always this is an incident that is on its way to reform eventually and someday in the future. So the violence that you have now,
It's always one bad apple, right?
exactly, it's one bad apple. It's or one bad case of one bad apple or something like that. But that does a number of different things, because it's not true. As a number of people have shown, that you're not really going to have you wouldn't say the same thing of a clan member, right? You wouldn't say that, okay, it's just one lynching in the clan organization, but everything else works out. But the only reason that you would say about the police is because, again, just like your affections with the colony, you have an affection with the police state, and so you continuously believe in this redemption and it's being redeemed. So you would say things like, okay, well, one day things change, but it doesn't. Like at the same time, one of the things that is angering about it is that, okay, well, maybe it will change. It won't, but say that it does change. I was hit today. So what are we going to do about that? It's not satisfactory to me to know that I might not be hit tomorrow, or I might be hit less tomorrow. I have not signed up in this system of being hit. I have not signed up into this program itself. And so even if you have dreams of an eventual redemption, my bullies I have no interest in maintaining and believing in the redemption of my bullies, my aggressors, my attackers. And so it says something about the dehumanizing of my own experience, that you continuously believe in the reform capabilities of people who you know very well have taken gleeful steps to murder people in full view of the public and camera. This is why I would say that what the settler does, whatever position that they have a tendency to dehumanize people. So that they would say, after you are being bled, after you're standing and being bled, after your family has been caught through slave catchers and put into the slave holes that are now detention camps, they would say, hold on, wait, things might get better. Because you don't matter. But if you slap them, they'll slap you right back. Or if you sue them, they'll sue you back. They'll defend them. But if you are bled on the street and if you suffer on the street, then you are told to wait. And the only reason you're told to wait is because you do not count. And my disinterest in having marauding, violent groups and organizations that have been historically proven to be dangerous to people like me, for me to want their existence, my disinterest in their existence, that does not count, because what is offered to me, like the scraps thrown out of the slave master's house, is change, is hope, is something. I didn't sign up for that. I didn't want change or hope. I am disinterested in the existence of my enemies. And if you're not down with that, then it probably says, what's Hydra?
Mm. One thing that I find very interesting, you were talking about these, marauding, violent gangs that call themselves police officers. On the one hand, it is an incredibly violent, colonial, aggressive, patriarchal, misogynistic institution. On the other hand, it's an incredibly delicate institution, at least by their own narratives, right? Because police are always trying to appeal to people for more money, for more funding, for more personnel, talking about how dangerous it is, the thin blue line, blah, blah, blah. A police officer leaves their house every day, kisses their partner, and never knows if they're going to return. And one of the things that really annoys me about that is just how non-factual it is, how it's bullshit. And I was looking at the statistics the other day to prep for our interview, and I was looking up police fatalities in the United States and the fatalities of the most dangerous professions. And it's not even close. The most dangerous profession in the United States are loggers. 99 loggers per 100,000 are killed. After that, it's professional fishers and hunters. That's about 86 per 100,000. Roofers, about 51 roofers per 100,000 are killed on the job. Police, it's 13. 13 per 100,000 versus loggers, 99 per 100,000. Why do you think that myth continues to resonate so powerfully, not just in the American public, probably the Canadian public and the German public too, that policing is this dangerous profession and we need to coddle our police officers, when it's just transparently and factually false?
I mean, and let's say nothing of the job occupations that are being unhoused, being an inmate, being an immigrant, which involves labor and the labor of survival and labor, like labor itself. Those occupations who very rarely end up in those type of charts are also extremely much more dangerous. But yeah, I mean, for me, I don't know that it's a profession, but let's say that it is a profession. Um, I mean, okay, well, the mistress of the slave owner's house has also had the same argument, that it is extremely dangerous to be a mistress on a slave plantation. At any moment, the slaves can revolt and burn down the door, and anything can happen. The slave masters used to have pistols and hide them under their pillows, saying that they were scared that the slaves might revolt. And this was a very strong argument. The same, you could find that in Kenya, settlers saying that, yeah, it is dangerous to be a settler. It's dangerous to be flogging my natives every week, because you never know which one of them is going to be hostile. So, like, I do believe that the business of harming people can have blowback, and because it can have blowback, it is dangerous. I don't, but I also have very little time for the slaveholder who is also complaining about how dangerous it is to be a slaveholder. have very little time for the corrections officer that also says they have a hard time being corrections officer. I have very little time of the person who breaks into people's houses and burns it down, saying how hard it is, the job I have to be an arsonist in the suburb. It is a dangerous job. It is a dangerous profession to maintain the genocidal occupation, to maintain colonialism. It is dangerous because despite what your bosses might have told you, the people that you are harming are humans, and humans have a tendency of not liking to be harmed and to bite back.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the facts are so easily accessible, and that makes the actual narratives, the false narratives that are put out by these organizations and the ahistorical narratives that are just completely preposterous, so much more frustrating. Um, Speaking of ahistorical, one of my last questions I wanted to ask you about is from your article, Black Liberal, Your Time is Up, which was published in Al Jazeera in June 2020. You talk a lot about the use and misuse of the words and the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, both by white and black liberals and white and black conservatives. I was hoping you could expound on that and just describe for our listeners just how, again, for lack of a better word, preposterous the narrative about what Dr. King is and what he represents has become in, 21st century settler colonial America.
Um, yeah, and I'll take this moment to plug my course. So I teach online now as self-deportee / exilee, where I right now I'm teaching a course called The End of Supplication, which is going to be based on my forthcoming book. But one of the chapters is about the muzzle of civil rights, and actually that's what we're going to be talking about today in the class. And what it is how civil rights operates, a narrative of civil rights. Because again, civil rights is just an invention of historians who want to narrate the Black uprising against totalitarian Black codes, etc., the Jim Crow establishment, as something that was actually in the interest of advancing the settler colonial state, and to speak about rights and the civil, when in a number of ways uprisings try to move against that. So it is a muzzle on what you can say, because you're not allowed to be able to disagree with Martin Luther King. Despite the fact that there were contemporaries of Martin Luther King who disagreed, probably most famously Malcolm X. So you're not allowed to say anything that is supposed to pose it, because it's like a taboo thing. Like it's almost, I feel like as an anti-colonialist, I very often have to kind of explain myself, even amongst people who are generally on the side of anti-oppression, how I have no interest in Dr. King or anything King-like. And I do this performatively almost, because I have to demonstrate that there is a possibility to be able to think and do things differently. You can be Black and not beholden to the King establishment. And so I almost have to exaggerate my distance from King, even though it is a real distance, exaggerate it, or at least underline it, just to move out of the caricature that every single movement against white supremacist totalitarianism is just a placard holding "we shall overcome, change gonna come" type of sit down type of thing. That is not the case. And it is the case that Martin Luther King, for whatever value it has to some people, and I don't want to disrespect people who've actually like walked and marched with him and have also, if not fetishized him, kind of had an association with him that gives him a lot of meaning. It has been extremely useful to be able to police the radical imagination and domesticate radical imagination, no matter how useful King's, whatever value King has. Because if he was a kind of, sometimes he would say that he's an anti-imperialist, that he was against the war to his later years, etc., and all whatever that is, he is able to be appropriated by white supremacy in ways that a number of other figures cannot. Like it's much harder. I mean, it's always possible. You can appropriate anyone if you give it enough juice. but it is so you don't hear the same thing about Nat Turner that much. You don't hear the same thing even about Steve Biko that much. You don't hear anything about the old unnamed black women who are poisoning masters as a way of redeeming. But for some reason, Martin Luther King is much more amenable to the interests of colonialism. And so they latch onto it because at one point he is half a representation of a type of colonial justice or just justice, not having to be oppressed and live under totalitarianism. So that is a symbolic weight and pull on the heartstrings of a number of people. But at the same time, he is also a cudgel of the white supremacists that can use it to say, well, if you step outside of the sidewalk when you're protesting, then Martin Luther King will be turning in his grave, etc. And so you can beat down the rebellion of black people just by mentioning his name, which is why, again, he's a Muslim. And civil rights itself is a muzzle rather than anything else. So it says, and I would say that the reason why Martin Luther King is such a favorite amongst white supremacists is because of his patriotism or his belief that settler colonialism can be reformed into something that's useful. Whether or not he believed it, he definitely advocated for it, or he pulled on white racist America's heartstrings to be able to see if they would somehow let him go, and they just shot him. So I just believe that whatever value that Martin Luther King had, we've now come to the point where we need to put that aside and to open up or diversify the type of black thought and black radical thought that exists. And we do not have to doff our caps to King, to civil rights, to anything similar to that, just because whether it is our guilt about our civil rights past, in quotes, or because a white supremacist tells us you better listen to King or we're going to get you. We must move away from kingliness.
That's a great lead into my final question. What are some black radical thinkers or movements, anti-colonial thinkers or movements that you're following today that, I don't want to say give you hope because that sounds awful trite, but that you feel are on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not just an anti-colonialist, but I do have a lot of connections to Frantz Fanon and or his writings, and so I think I have a general distance with movements as much as spontaneous uprising. So when it is when it's just regular unpoliticized youth that are rising up and uh, showing their disdain for their situation, whether it is by uprising after a police killing, a spontaneous uprising after a police killing, or a song about it, etc. These are the things. If hope is something that I need, then that is what would inspire me.
Why
It
do
is
those
the
inspire you more than more organized campaigns?
Because I just am generally, and this might be connected to the anarchist nature, but I'm just suspicious that when things become organized, they end up looking like political parties. Or it's not that, I mean, because I also am cool with the Marxists who want an organized smashing of the state. I mean, that's a debate that, whatever. Um, except I do feel that people are too much drenched, as a general rule, into the settler colonial mindset that when they try to organize, the terms of organization seems to mirror the settler colonial state, which is why we have parties and which is why we have things that look like organizing in terms of the establishments organizing. But obviously, when one Bridget links up with another Bridget and say, "Yo, we're gonna link up at this street at this time to do something against the police establishment," there's organizing there as well. But then that becomes read as spontaneous because we do not legitimate the collective forms of resistance that do not mirror the establishment institutions, etc. But that's not to say that there are not a few organizations that I'm cool with. Like in history, I'm definitely down with the FLN. I'm down with certain aspects of the early ANC, but really the Pan African Congress, etc. in what is called the United States, the All Africans People's Revolutionary Party as well. It's very hard, even though I haven't been in an organization since I was in Toronto. It's very difficult for me to not officially join to them as well, because they almost do nothing wrong. I generally never see them do anything wrong. They're always on point in general. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm always going to be more connected to those people who are like the neighborhoods that I grew up in Rexdale in Toronto, where it's not so much. I do not believe so much that, because what happens is the organizations usually come into, and I'm guilty of this too. They come into the hood, they come into the ghetto, and try to radicalize people so that they can join an organization. When my general belief is that the organizations themselves should become more gangster. It's not that the radicals should get the gangsters to be the radical, but that um, the organizations themselves have to be more gangster, because generally, in a lot of gangster culture, there is a disdain with speaking to the police. There is a disdain for a type of wishy-washy attitude, to follow and abide by laws. All these type of things are extremely useful lessons that any organization could learn, rather than to take them out of this almost inherent structural disagreement with colonialism, and to pull them into what they consider more radical, which ends up more looking like a workers' party.
Well, Dr. Marshall, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really, really appreciate it. For those of you listening, you can find a lot of Dr. Marshall's work, including links to some videos, some interviews, and the online courses he teaches at yannickgiovannimarshall.net. I will make sure that we link the website in our show notes. And again, thank you so much for appearing on Seeds of Revolution, Dr. Marshall. This was really fun and enlightening.
Cool, respect. Thank you very much. Hope we can do this again sometime when I'm less caffeinated.
I think you had the perfect amount of caffeine, and we look forward to seeing you in Camus Books for a book launch when you finish your newest work.
Perfect. We'll do that.
If Jesus Christ came back today like you threatened he will, which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Yeah, who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well,